So as he responded to God and gathered others around him, and then set out, almost as a nomad, traveling from place to place with a band of followers, speaking about God and our relationship with God and each other, Jesus kept running into some difficulty. Those in his hometown were deeply suspicious of him and what they perceived he had become. The religious authorities thought of him as a troublemaker. Lawyers wondered about his interpretation of the law. But strangely, crowds gathered around him and things happened when he was around. People got healed. The blind received their sight. The lame got up and walked. From scant resources, thousands were fed. And as his band of disciples followed him on his journeys, they wondered who he really was, and even sometimes, what was all this fuss going on around him and them? And when he asked them who he was, like who did they say that he was? Well, some of them got it, like Peter. He claimed that he was the Son of the living God. For who could do such things except God himself, or maybe someone who was deeply related to God? But others wondered, because although he seemed to cause some political turmoil, as with the Roman soldiers, the colonial authorities, he did not seem interested in the kind of political power that they had come to expect. A leader that they imagined might be like David, a king and a military conqueror. No, this Jesus was not like that. In fact, his idea of leadership had elements that were deeply disturbing. He was not talking about military leadership and earthly power. He was talking not only about self-sacrifice and humility, not only about losing one's life so that one could save it, but also about dying, and then about some notion of 3 days later coming back. So the underlying question for the disciples must have been rooted in their need to understand how God was at work in all this, with them and with their group, and with this man that they had given up everything to follow. I almost imagine them looking up to heaven with arms outstretched, saying, "What is going on here, God?" Have you been at one of those places in your life where whatever your circumstances are, you're just confused and you wonder where God is at work and where God's hand is? I remember the end of my mother's life here on this earth, having faithfully supported her in her last days in hospice, which she had asked that I do, and that when she was ready for hospice care, I had had for years to promise that I would really help her. But I awakened on day 14 of her hospice care, having been told on day 1 by the doctors that she wouldn't have lasted more than 3 days. So 14 days later, I got up and I remember I just had a crisis. I thought, oh my gosh, I've agreed to support her in this thing and I've made all the wrong decisions, and maybe she wasn't ready to die, and maybe something else was going on, and maybe, and maybe, and maybe. In my anguish, I cried out to God and asked, what is going on here, God? And it is not exactly like I got an answer, but I was given this glimpse. It was almost a vision, not quite a dream, but a picture in my mind. And it was a picture of my father, who at that point had been dead for 12 years, And it was a picture of him entering into the room and leaning down and picking my mother's body up and gently carrying it out of the room. And so I shook my head really fast, and I said, okay, God, no tricks. This isn't fair. And I paused, and I closed my eyes again, and I had this very same vision, and I finally had to say, take a deep breath and say, I'm going to believe you this time. You may remember, some of you here remember our parishioner Judith Ann DeLasso. Do you remember Judith Ann? A longtime parishioner here, very faithful, always a little bit on the edge and maybe even a little crazy. At the end of her life, her body was deeply ridden with cancer, but she was so faithful that she said her prayer would be, when we would pray together, she would say, now, God, it would be okay with me if you want me to be a miracle and you want to heal me so that, your power could get known. It was really cute and wonderful, and yet her illness continued. So, with Judith Ann, she had the help of some folks here in the parish because she had no children, and she didn't really have folks who were close to her. So Billy Isaacs had agreed to help her with all of her medical stuff, and I was helping her with the other stuff. And Billy and I were both sure that we wanted, if possible at all in God's universe, for someone to be with this woman who had really lived a rather solitary life, to be with her near her death. And so there she was in hospice care herself, and she was, her breathing was getting labored, and it seemed as though her body was shutting down, and Billy was there, but he had to leave town on an important business proposition. He had to go do a lecture somewhere, so he called me, and I drove very quickly to her room. And as I arrived, I brought my prayers, and I said the prayers for the sick and dying. And just literally, as I finished the last prayer, she took her last breath. It was a little bit of a glimpse of a miracle, that Billy and I weren't far off from maybe God's will and wanting to be with her. It was hard to know exactly, but it was such perfect timing that we both had to sort of pause and think about that. I called him right away, and he said, well, God must have been at work. So I was at this conference this week, the Consortium of Endowed Episcopal Parishes. It's a conference that we go to every year here in our church because we gather with a lot of really vibrant and vital Episcopal parishes from all over the country. And we sort of exchange stories, and we get inspired by each other's stories and what God is doing in our lives and in our churches. So I was very, very late in arriving on my first day. I had gotten behind my work. I was preparing for this annual meeting that we were having today, and I almost didn't go at all. And then I decided, okay, well, I'm just going to go down, catch a train, even if I arrive 2 hours late at my meeting. And I thought, and maybe I'll get there, and I'll just go to my hotel room and I'll take a nap. So I got there, and when I got to the registration desk, I looked at everything, and then I said, okay, I guess I'll take a cab over to Virginia Seminary and try to find my group. So I got to Virginia Seminary, and I looked around, and I didn't see my group anywhere, and I kept thinking maybe I should just keep the cab here and go back, but I stayed. So I went over into the chapel. They have a new chapel at Virginia Seminary, and I sat down, and pretty soon my group found me. They came to look at the new chapel. And so as I was sitting there, a colleague here in this diocese came and sat down next to me, and she said to me, so what's going on with you? And so I told her, and I can't even remember the words I said, but I basically told her about our last year, and that we had set out to do this capital campaign, and that really, quite surprisingly, we were a wild success, and that we had raised over $5 million. I honestly don't remember one word I said to her, but she looked at me. She got tears in her eyes, and then she smiled and she said, well, if you're wondering why you came to this conference, I just want to tell you, you came to tell me that story. And she talked about how that story, that I can't even remember how I told it, made all the difference to her, that her parish was trying to mount a capital campaign, and she had sworn that she was never doing another capital campaign in her life, and her parish kept reminding her of how patently unsuccessful every other past campaign had been, and that somehow, whatever those words were that I spoke to her, had made a huge difference. And so she was going to return to her parish with some courage to, for the sake of the church and God, to really risk again. It was just sort of a glimpse, a moment, sort of like stalled in time, where God gave me just the right words to speak, unaware as I was, speak to a heart that was longing to hear a word of encouragement. It was just a moment, that minute, when Judith Ann took her last breath and then slipped into eternity. But someone was with her, and she left this earth knowing she was not alone. It happened to be me who was standing there. It could have easily been Billy the hour before. And it was just a fleeting vision of my dad carrying my mom that calmed my fears and healed my guilt and gave me courage to go on. And that is all that those three disciples, Peter and James and John, got on that mountain with Jesus. That glimpse, a moment, a fleeting vision. What they saw and heard was beyond all politics. They saw the one they were following, standing with the heroes of their faith. They heard the voice of God confirm his identity. They knew that they were not that crazy, at least in that moment. It all made sense. Their fears were calmed. God was at work. Sure, their control needs reared up, and they wanted to freeze the frame. They wanted to build some booths and capture Jesus and Moses and Elijah and keep everything just as it was. But, God doesn't stay around that long. It's just one moment after another. And God can't be ushered in a booth or put in a box. And no matter, in the end, they had that feeling of being freed from their terror just for a little while. And maybe that is all they needed to continue in their lives. When they finished that vision on the mountain, they with Jesus returned down to the floor of the earth, ready for the work that was to come. It was hard work, was full of disappointment and betrayal, incredible brutality and cowardice, all the messiness of humanity and the worst of human behavior played out on a larger stage. The road to Jerusalem, that path to the cross, was for them and is for us painful and ugly and confusing. It could have ripped them apart or torn their hearts out or left them bereft and alone. But they remembered what they saw and that voice on the mountain. They remembered that moment when their fears were vanquished and it sustained them. So I don't know what moments have sustained you in your life, but I suspect that you sit here because you too have had some glimpses, that there have been just these moments where you have seen God at work or known that you were a part of something much larger than yourself. And so today, this last Sunday before together we all begin Lent, it's our day to remember those moments, to stretch our memories and think, when was it that we had some sense that we were at peace, or that God had relieved us, or had encouraged us? So as we prepare to head into this Lent, let's pause for just a moment, and I'll let you think about that moment for you. From that moment or those moments, I hope you know the powerfulness of God, the peacefulness of the divine, and that you have the capacity to live your lives free from fear. Amen.